Great to have you all here. My name's Alan, and I'm going to be talking about how to make AI work for your team in this session. So we're all familiar with the buzz that's surrounded AI. It is the technology of the moment. And as public sector organizations, we're also getting a lot of pressure from above to try and use AI in a way that can increase efficiency, productivity, hopefully improve outcomes for the people who are using our services. And the kind of promise of AI was that we would get a kind of virtual or robotic employee who could sit amongst our teams, picking up loads of work for us, and making everything run a lot more smoothly. Now, I think anyone who's had a play around will with tools like ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot will start to see that actually it's not as simple as that. And there's a big human element to what we need to do here. We need to find the ways of using these kind of tools in an effective manner and also safely as well. As public sector organizations, particularly, some of you may not be, but a lot of you will be. We are obviously not operating as kind of Silicon Valley startups. We can't take shortcuts in what we do with people's data. We have to make sure that we're behaving in a manner that's ethical as well as safe from a legal standpoint. So those are the two things I want to cover today. How can we get the most out of AI tools by using them in an effective way? And also, how can we make sure that we're doing this as safely as possible? Just so you know where I'm coming from with this, my background was originally in the dim and distant past in journalism. I was working in magazines. I moved into digital content and then moved into working in tech roles, so actually building digital products and working on digital transformation projects as well. And then I moved into doing a lot of work with data. So how organizations were using data to make decisions, how they were presenting that data in different ways, dashboards and slide decks and things. And then that has naturally led me on to working with a lot of AI tools, because the real value out of AI tools comes when you can connect them to the information and the data that you have internally within your organization. That's when you turn something that is very smart but doesn't know a lot about your subject area into something that can actually have the expertise to provide you with reliable information and so on. But obviously that then raises those safety concerns and those ethical concerns that I mentioned at the start. How do we make sure that we're in a secure way allowing it to have access to the data that we use for work? So there's really four things I want to cover today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the role of AI tools in working with communications. So if you are thinking of sending out emails, if you're doing press releases, communications with members of the public, and also internal reporting and that kind of thing, where it is best to deploy AI tools and the different ways in which they can help. Secondly, I'm going to talk about connecting AI tools to your internal data sets, but also I'm using data in the broadest sense possible. So that will include text documents, that will include any source of information that can help narrow down what the tool is actually looking at. Thirdly, I'll talk about the actual technologies involved. So what are the different ways you might encounter AI and what some of the pros and cons are around those different types of engagement. And then finally, talk about ethics and how we can do this as safely as possible. So let's start off with communications, because this is the area that I'm finding people are getting the most traction. So just for context, I'm now seeing that I'm doing more and more training work in this area with different public sector organizations, both within the UK and internationally. And applying AI tools to communications is the area where people seem to be getting the most value out of it. And I would break this down into four different areas where AI tools can help when you're producing communications, either when you're thinking internally or if you're thinking externally and you're communicating with members of the public, the press, and so on. So I tend to break it down into these. Firstly, where it can help with brainstorming. Secondly, where it can help with first drafts. Thirdly, editing. And then fourthly, enriching. So I'll go through each one in turn. So in brainstorming, AI tools are very good at getting you around blank page syndrome. So that is when you are starting to produce a new report or a new blog post, anything like that, and you need to come up with some new ideas. And hopefully you've got colleagues you can bounce these kind of ideas off, but this is another sounding board that you can use. You can ask it to generate ideas. And the good thing about this is there is very little that can go wrong, because if it comes up with ideas that are frankly rubbish, then you can reject those. So it's going to give you a starting point, even if you then go off and do something completely different. So brainstorming examples of that might be, here's some ideas of an area that we want to write some blog posts around. Can you come up with some ideas for blog posts in that area? Now, with all of these, it's going to be helpful, and I'm talking more about this in the second section, but if we can give it as much contextual information as possible. So if we can describe where our blog post is, what audience we're aiming at, and maybe give it examples of the 10 best performing blog posts that we've written over the course of the last year, all of those things are going to narrow down its focus so that it knows, okay, that's what I'm aiming for. But it can then come up with a list of ideas, and as I say, you can reject or accept those. From more of an internal communications point of view, maybe you've got to write some kind of longer report or a proposal. You can ask the AI tool to come up with a list of things that you might want to include within that document. So a kind of contents list that will allow you to have a starting point. Even then, when you're going to move things around, you might reject some of those ideas again, but it will give you a starting point. Just to the question in the chat, yes, there will be a recording of this session. Or you could ask it to come up with new names, sorry, for a project. Maybe you're launching a public-facing project and you want to be able to you want to come up with some creative names for it. It can give you 50 different names. You will reject 49 of them, and you might change the 50th one slightly. But it's just giving you that starting point where you've got a ton of ideas to choose from, rather than be staring at a blank page and trying to come up with everything by yourself. So brainstorming is the first place that I would probably deploy this kind of technology. Then there's first drafts. So maybe now you've got your list of blog posts and you want it to come up with a first draft of a blog post. Now, as a writer by background, I don't tend to let Copilot, any AI tool, I'll talk about Copilot in a minute, but any AI tool do the entirety of the writing for me. But it could be a way of getting it to do an initial first draft, even though you know you're going to change that. You know you're going to apply your subject matter knowledge and expertise over the top of that, and you're going to turn it into something different. So certainly we're not talking here about getting AI to write something and then immediately publishing it out on your website or pushing it out to members of the public, but certainly doing a first version of something. Again, there's very little that can go wrong there, because you can adapt, edit, and sign that off before it goes anywhere. You might also get it to write a first version of one section of the document that it's sketched out for you in terms of contents. Or you could get it to come up with, once it's got the name of a project, come up with an initial short description that we can use to describe that project internally or externally. And then there's editing. So when you have written something, or you have got an initial first version of something, you can ask for feedback from these AI tools as well. So maybe you want it to suggest more search engine optimized versions of titles for the blog post that you've created. Maybe you want it to change the tone of voice for a document. These tools are very good at doing that. They can change for informal versus formal. They can change for concision. They can make things briefer. They can even suggest things that might be missing from the document, for instance. You could even ask it to translate something into a different language. Now, this is a bit of a dicey area, just because if you don't speak the language, or you can't read the language that you're getting it to translate into, then how will you know if it's correct? So that would be a warning there. But these tools are pretty powerful, and they are built on large language models, particularly the generative AI tools. And so they know a lot about how language is structured and how language works. So they can do these kind of adaptations. Again, rather than just asking it to change what you've written, for instance, you could ask it just to give you notes on what you might want to change. That gives you the opportunity to then say yes to that one and no to that one. So you're still in control of the process, but it is helping to give you ideas. And then finally, there's enriching. So that could be, okay, I now need an image for that blog post. Now, it could either suggest images that might be suitable, which you could go and find in your image library, or it could generate images as well. We know that image generation is one of the things that these kind of tools can do. You might want to output your report, but you might want it in quite a specific format. So you might have a template that you use internally. So you want to now say, this information here, put it into that format. That kind of structuring is something that these tools are pretty good at doing. Or you might want it to create something like a logo for your new project. So it came up with a name, it's come up with a description, it can now come up with a logo. So all the way through this, we have the opportunity to reject what's being suggested. And there is a key concept here of human in the loop. We don't really want to let the AI tools at this stage run off and do things on their own. But if they can make suggestions and changes and add things in throughout the process, then we have the option of editing that out. We can decide to reject some of their suggestions. So we're using it as a kind of assistant, but not as our boss, basically. So that's brainstorming, first drafting, editing, and then enriching through communications. Those are the ways that I've predominantly seen it used. Now, all of this becomes more powerful, as I said, if you can connect it to your internal information, because there will be a lot of specific stuff within your organization that it won't be able to necessarily find out if it's just swimming around on the wider web, or if it's looking at very general sources of information. So this is where data comes in. Now, again, I'm using data in the broadest sense possible. So data could be a spreadsheet of numbers, but data equally could be an 80-page PDF policy document. It could be your intranet. For AI's purposes, everything is data. It will take an image as data. It will take numbers as data. It will take text as data. So there are a few ways that we can connect our data to these kind of tools. Now, the first one, and most obviously, is that they can now go out on the web and search for things for us. So there are increasingly, I just know anecdotally, more people that I know are using AI as a kind of search engine before they'll go to Google, for instance. So you can ask it for quite a specific fact, and it will go away and it will try and find that fact for you. You can also ask these tools to give you a general briefing on a subject. So if you pick a subject you don't know anything about and don't really understand, like quantum computing, you can ask it to give you a 500-word or a bullet-pointed explanation of how quantum computing works. You can ask it to explain that in simple terms. Try asking it to explain it to you as if you're 5. I use that fairly often, and it's quite a good way of breaking down a brand new concept into something that is understandable. There are some caveats here. You probably need to be wary of where it is finding the information. By nature, a lot of these tools will go out on the wider web, and they will tend to be quite US slanted. So if you ask it a question about benefits recipients, for instance, it might well go and try and find information from the USA, which won't be relevant if you work in the UK. So you probably want to make sure your search is relevant to the UK. I'm presuming here that you work in the UK. If you work in a different territory, then obviously make it relevant to your country or your region. You can ask it to go to specific sources. So you could specify, go to these government websites and find this information. Don't go and find it from other random sources. And you can always check the output that it gives you. So it should give you source links for every fact that it's pulling out. And if it doesn't, you can ask it to do that. So always check where the information has come from. In the background here is unfortunately the tendency of some of these AI tools to hallucinate, which means that if they don't know the answer to something, they will try and be helpful by making an answer up. And they can do that in a very convincing way. They will even provide you with citations that look like real academic citations. So if you're asking for hard facts, then getting it to give you the source material, the source link for those facts is always going to be best practice. So we don't just want to use web searches, because here we can see there is some, it's a bit opaque about where it might be getting the information from. And there's a lot of checking that we're going to have to go back and do to make sure that it hasn't found something that's come from an erroneous source. So we can also then connect it to more of our internal stuff. And this is where we know that we're pointing at information that is likely to be more reliable because it comes from within our organization. So firstly, we can allow it to have access to our meetings. You probably already, if you're using Teams or you're using Zoom, you've seen people using AI note takers to effectively do a transcript or the minutes of that meeting. Those are very flexible because they run in an automated way in the background, but then also you can ask for summaries of those. You can ask it to identify actions that were allocated to somebody or decisions that were made. You can also get it to suggest actions or solutions. So for things that you never got to quite solve in the meeting, you can ask the AI tool, what would you suggest we do there? Again, you can reject that if you want to, but it gives you a starting point. You can ask it to compare ideas or suggestions. So if you were having a brainstorm about where we're going to have the Christmas party this year, then you could ask it to pull those together as a neat list, say who suggested each one. So those meeting minutes or those meeting notes become very, very flexible. Rather than being static documents that no one ever reads, they can become searchable histories of what was discussed in a meeting and so on. You can also analyze across multiple meetings. So if you are running a project where actually we've had 6 different meetings and maybe we've also got some other documentation somewhere else that relates to this project, you can ask it to do kind of searches across all of that. So one of the more kind of powerful ways that these AI tools can be used internally is as a sort of superpowered or supercharged search that can go across multiple different systems and multiple different documents and pull information from all of them. The advantage here is we are getting it to look internally. We're not getting it to swim out on the wider web now. We are asking it to look at the stuff that we know we've discussed. So by keeping the blinkers on it, we're starting to get more accurate information. You can also ask it to carry out sentiment analysis. So if you were doing something that was more like interviews of members of the public or focus groups, you can, and you are transcribing those because they are on a video call, you can ask it to go through and pull out themes, or you can ask it to go and pull out positive and negative sentiment from those meetings as well. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat. I will leave questions for the end, but if there's anything that's particularly relevant, I'm going to pull it out now. Can you ask it to not invent facts? That hasn't really reliably been shown to work. What AI tools are trying to do is be as helpful as possible. And for some reason, they believe that giving you something is better than giving you nothing. So they're very bad at saying, I don't know. And it's hard to get them to avoid inventing facts. Sourcing the information is usually the best way around that. Then beyond meetings, we can also connect the AI to our emails. And this is a very powerful area. If you think about the fact that what I'm mostly focused on here is how we can use AI effectively, which probably means saving you some time or speeding up some kind of process. Now, for anyone who works in the public sector, private sector, or charity sector, what is the thing that takes up most of our time? It's probably a lot of our email inbox alongside the meetings. So within email inboxes, you need a tool that can speak to your email inbox. So if you're using Google Mail, then you'll probably need to be using Google's AI tool. If you are using Outlook, then you probably need to be using Microsoft Copilot. There will be other ways to connect things, but probably it makes sense to go with the one that is natively connected. So now it can go through and summarize entire email threads. So let's take a very common situation. You've been on holiday, you've come back, everyone's ignored your out of office reply, and you have hundreds of emails in your email inbox. And then you notice that one of those emails is sort of 40 or 50 emails long, and clearly something terrible happened. You've been looped into it. There's been an ongoing conversation. You could spend an entire morning unpicking that thread to find out, okay, what went wrong? Was it to do with me? Has this already been solved? In which case I can take it off my to-do list, or is there something I need to pick up and actually action? You can now ask the AI tool to go through that entire thread of emails and summarize what happened, what actions were taken, who said what, bullet pointed fashion, and even tell you if there's outstanding actions and nothing was decided. And at that point, you might decide, okay, I'm not going to add another email to this email chain. Let's just get everyone who's on this email chain into a meeting for half an hour so that we can sort this problem out. The AI tool can then look through all those people's calendars and try and find a free slot where you can get everyone on the same call to sort this out. So that kind of sifting your emails, finding out what's in there that might be problematic is becoming a very powerful bit of functionality. It can identify where you've been mentioned and things that were directed at you. Now, again, it might miss some stuff, but it's still a better starting point than just looking at your email inbox with all of these unread chains in there. It can look for dates, like things like when was the last meeting, what milestones did we agree. I find this very useful because my job is being a trainer and I have to keep track of a lot of dates that I've got booked in with clients. So checking which dates I've offered out to who and which ones were confirmed, it can go back through my emails and pick those things out because it knows what a date looks like. It can draft messages and replies. Again, I would recommend probably not just getting the AI to do it and immediately sending it out. You probably want a pause point where you check through what it's created. But for a lot of the emails we send out are pretty mundane. It is thanks for the information. Yes, I'll attend the meeting. It's very, very formulaic stuff. So you can start to use it for those kind of things just to get a basic structure that you can then check quickly and send out the door. Again, it can edit those messages for tone, for length. If you're worried about your writing skills, if you feel that you're too verbose in emails, it will edit them for concision. It will bring them down in terms of length. If you're worried you're being too formal, it can make them more informal or vice versa. Some of these tools will even turn your email, once you've written it, into a poem, which is not necessarily a massive use case for that. That's where they're showing off. But what they want to show off there is the functionality that comes particularly with large language models, that they understand the structure of language really well. So it can take an email that you've written and it can turn it into a poem. And again, I've already mentioned it can set up meetings and calls. I'm just again going to have a quick scan of the chat. So I'll talk about the internal versus external data. I'll make a note of that. In terms of shared mailboxes and can it check everyone's calendars and set up meetings, this entirely depends on the tool you're using and the licenses you have. So really, in the scenario I described, where it can go through an email chain and then invite everyone to a meeting and check all their calendars, all of those people would need to have a license for the same AI tool, and I've got one in mind that I'm going to talk about. And then they would all have to have their calendars set to a place where people can put meetings into their calendar. And that also goes for if you have an assistant, an EA, a PA, they would also need a license for the software. So a lot of this is about licensing of the actual tools. One thing I should stress when I'm talking about licensing is if you're using the free version of any AI tool, you should probably not be putting work information into it because the controls are not there. And one of the issues is that are these systems using this data to train their own models, which I think relates to the internal external data question. Now, if you have a professional license or an enterprise license for these tools, then they should not be sucking your internal data back into their models to train them. And there should be contractual stuff that can be signed off by senior people that will say that that's the case. But don't be putting free stuff into a free version of ChatGPT. Even if it's very unlikely to get found out, you're probably breaking GDPR. So just be very careful with that. Then beyond emails, we also have documents. A lot of these tools will work with multiple different types of documents. One of the tools I'm going to mention is the Microsoft version, and that obviously is naturally attuned to working with Word files, PowerPoint files, Excel files. But most of these are readable by different AI tools. They can go through a large document and generate a summary for you. So if anyone's working with the classic 80-page PDF policy document, it's quite nice to be able to instantly generate a bullet pointed summary of what's in that if you're encountering it for the first time. It can also retrieve specific pieces of information. So if you know that there's something in there, but you don't know where it is, it will go and try and dig that out for you. And it can reformat the information as well. So it might be able to take stuff from a PDF and put it into a table, for instance, or take stuff out of a static PDF document and put it into an editable Word file. So that reformatting can save you quite a bit of time. Again, it can suggest changes to tone, clarity, and so on if it's writing, and it can suggest additions as well. So you can ask it to read a document and suggest what isn't here that probably should be, and it will at least give you an attempt at doing that. Again, you may reject its suggestions, but it gives you a nice starting point. And then very usefully, we can also use it for things like spreadsheets as well. Spreadsheets are very structured in terms of how they're constructed. And the kind of things you can expect these AI tools to do within spreadsheets is things like generating formulas or new columns or rows, like calculated new columns. It can dig out specific data points. So I've done a lot of throwing a spreadsheet at one of these tools that it might have 14 different tabs on it, and loads of rows of data, and getting it to give me a summary of what's in that spreadsheet. That's a very useful starting point because that will orient you to where the data is, even if you then want to go back in and manually actually find stuff. It can do certain amounts of data analysis, and certainly this functionality is getting more and more powerful. At the moment, it's not that advanced, as in it will often give you quite what would be called descriptive analytics. So it will be able to identify an average or something that looks like a particular outlier, but it might not get more sophisticated than that. But there are more specialized tools coming through that can do much more deep dive analysis and also visualize the data for you as well. So pick up a data set and turn it into a chart based on a natural language instruction you've given it. So if you've ever fiddled around trying to get a chart to look exactly how you want it to look in a tool like Excel, then these tools should be able to shortcut that. If you know what you want it to be at the end of the process, there's no reason why these tools shouldn't be able to pick up the data and create those things for you. And again, it can look for gaps. So it could look, you could ask it, okay, what's in that spreadsheet and what insights could I get from that data? And it should be able to give you an idea of what it might be possible to extract from that given data set. So definitely some security issues which have been raised in the chat around connecting these things in, but by giving it more of your own data, you're giving it much better context to work with. By default, a lot of these AI tools, it's best to think about them like a very, very keen graduate who has just joined your organization. They're very smart, they have endless energy, and they will rattle through things, but they don't have a lot of subject matter knowledge or contextual information about what your organization does. The way that we provide that is by giving it access to internal information. So we have to do that safely, but that's where we get the real value from. Now, there's been a few tech questions in the chat. So how are we going to encounter these AI tools? Because obviously there's a certain amount, these are some of the most expensive technologies that have ever been created. And there are billions of pounds going into these. So how are we as mere mortals who are sitting at our desks trying to do our job going to encounter them? Well, the most likely way that you're going to encounter AI tools is connected to your existing software or within your existing software suites. Now, certainly within the UK, in the public sector, the most likely tool is Microsoft Copilot. And the simple reason for that is you're all already using a lot of Microsoft tools. So if you are using PowerPoint, Word, Excel, OneDrive, Outlook, Teams, then it makes sense that the Copilot tool that you're going to plug into that is going to be Microsoft's. The other reason for that is the safety aspect, is that Microsoft assures its customers two things. One is that any data that you give Microsoft Copilot access to, it's not going to go external and it's not going to go back into their central model to train their model to be better. So you have that control. Secondly, the principle with Microsoft Copilot is your version of Copilot has access to the same data that you do. So if you're allowed to access a document, it will be able to access a document. If you're allowed to access a mailbox, it's allowed to access a mailbox. But if you're not allowed to access those things, it won't be able to access them either. So if you think about things like HR information, there's probably controls around who should and shouldn't be able to access HR information on other employees. So it's sensible that these controls are around the edge of it. This would fall under a data governance, really. But Microsoft is very good at providing enterprise level software, and so they are assuring that those controls are in place. There are enterprise level or pro level versions of ChatGPT, which is another one that most of us will be familiar with. But if you're using more kind of novel tools that you found through a browser, maybe you're using a free version, you should assume that those are not safe to use for work information. If you're planning a birthday party, don't worry, go ahead. But if you are going to connect it to an internal spreadsheet, you really need to know what software you're using and whether it has been cleared by your organization. The pros or the upsides of this kind of approach, it's ready out of the box. You get a license, it's ready to use. Often it's going to be compatible with all your other systems. So Microsoft Copilot can talk to all of your other Microsoft tools. There's probably, if you were, for instance, working on Google software tech stack, then probably Gemini, which is their tool, will be able to talk to all your other tools. You get ongoing support and updates in the same way as you do for the rest of your software, mainly to stop IT getting an extra headache, but it does mean that everything should work. And if it doesn't work, there's someone who can fix it. And there is a community of other users out there because you're not using something completely bespoke. So there are other people out in the wider world using the same tools. So if you have a question, there are forums, there are places you can go to ask that. The cons, there is that risk of data leakage, although companies like Microsoft will assure you and contractually assure you that that's not going to happen. There's a certain lack of transparency. You're not going to get to know exactly how those algorithms work. You will know what they do and what they're good for, but you're not going to get access to the code base in any more than you would for Word or Excel. So that might be something that needs to be borne in mind. There is an ongoing cost here, and it's a per license cost. So every new person that gets access to one of these tools, that is an additional cost for your organization. And we know, IT budgets are already stretched, and so that will be a constraint on this. And there are limitations on how much custom development you can do. So Microsoft are not going to change this tool just for your organization. You are going to get what everyone else gets. So it can't be completely tailored to your use case. A step up from using the existing tools that are already out there would be going into partnership with some of the tech companies. There's been a few examples of this in the public sector. So this is people like IBM using their Watson X platform, or it could be Google Cloud AI, where you work with a tech company, you're going to pay them money, and they're going to build a solution for you that is tailored to your use case, but they'll probably want to be building something that actually they think they can resell in other places as well. So the pros here, it does outsource the complexity from a technology point of view. You don't want to have a whole bunch of very expensive AI developers in-house, so they take on that burden. You can tailor it a lot more to a specific internal use case. So one example here is there is a hospital trust in the UK who wanted effectively a chatbot for their HR systems, but a bit beyond something that would just check the intranet for the latest, policy documents. They wanted to be able to ask questions like, okay, I'm this person's line manager. How much holiday has this person got left to book before the end of the financial year? Now, that requires it to have actual access to the HR systems to know who that person is, what the reporting line is, and how many days holiday they've got, as well as checking a policy document. So that required more than you would get from an out-of-the-box tool, but they got some value out of it, and that was in partnership with IBM, and IBM will be thinking, well, we might be able to sell that solution to other people as well. So you basically collaborate with a technology partner. They're probably going to maintain it on their infrastructure. If you're not from a tech background, this doesn't really matter, but it will probably be hosted in the cloud somewhere. The downsides of this are it's a more expensive route to go down than certainly out of the box stuff would be. You are reliant on that partnership organization from then on. It'd be very difficult to work with IBM on building something and then decide you want to shift it to Google. So you are kind of sealed into a deal. There's going to be a certain amount of internal expertise that's going to be required, whether it is on your IT teams, but it's also, in the example I described, you would need the HR team to devote a certain amount of time to working on making that system work. And if you do a big overall investment and then you don't have money to update it over time, then that technology might start to date as well. We've all worked on systems that are maybe 20 years old in different parts of our organization, and we know the problems that come with that. So more powerful, more you can get out of it. There are some potential downsides as well. Then you will get approached by people who are offering very specialist third-party tools. So these are people who are building something that they think it might have come out of a partnership, it might have come out of something like this, and they're now trying to sell it to multiple different places. So for people like local councils, there are a few different solutions that are AI image recognition software that can spot fly tipping, for instance. They want to be able to sell that to multiple different local councils. You will have a lot of these tools that are kind of sector specific. They do a particular thing, either within part of your organization, finance, HR, and so on, or within a particular sector, healthcare, local government, and so on. So Waste Watch is one example, and that's the fly tipping example. Robin AI is a specific tool that deals with legal contracts. The pros of these are they're often pre-trained with quite a lot of specific data. So Robin AI will have been given millions of contracts to look at so that it's particularly expert in that type of structured information. You can outsource these with some kind of service level agreement. So you will pay a certain amount a month, but you will get something specified back for that money. You don't have to worry about the technology breaking and so on. And these things are built and maintained by specialists. So you're outsourcing the expertise. They can still end up being too general use. So if you end up with a tool that was designed for local government, but was designed internationally for local governments. It might not be specific enough for a UK use case, for instance. So you want to probably check that out in advance. You certainly want to get plenty of demos and get demos with real data going through it before you sign up to anything. These tend to require some kind of integration. They're not likely to naturally and immediately speak to your internal systems. So you're probably going to have to do some work on actually integrating them using APIs or something similar. And you definitely here need guarantees on data security. So you want them to have the same controls in place that Microsoft offer, which is they will not take your data and use it for another purpose externally, partly because you don't want that to happen, also because that may mean that you run foul of legal or ethical rules. And then if you wanted to go the whole way with AI tools, you could look at building something yourself. So normally what that means is picking up an open source, what's called a foundation model. So it's been pre-trained on a lot of data, but then you can then adapt it to a specific purpose. There are quite a few of these out there. Llama 2 and Bloom are just two examples. With this one, the pros are you have complete transparency on what it's doing and how it's built because you can literally see the code. There probably is going to be some kind of community around that model. So you will, but you would, your technical people will be able to talk to other people who've done work on this particular model, and it's fully customizable. You could tailor this for your exact purpose within your organization. However, the cons of this, you need significant development resource, and by that I mean programmers, coders. You need IT infrastructure. This has got to be hosted somewhere, so you probably need space on the cloud or something like that. Everything is going to be manual and you will be responsible for security. And the other thing that goes alongside all of that is this is the most expensive route to go down. So in general, in the public sector, this is only being done where there is a significant scale. So there are some tools being built in central government that are being designed to be used across the public sector. That's where the scale becomes sufficient to say, okay, it's worth us building our own thing here. But if you are doing something at a local level or an organizational level, it's likely that this would be prohibitive in terms of the costs you would need and the resources you would need in terms of experts in-house as well. Most likely thing you're going to encounter is something like Microsoft Copilot, certainly initially. And then because of these kind of security concerns and some of the questions about where the data is going to go, this is where we do need to think about both ethics and the law. And to make the distinction between what those both mean, this is from Giovanni Bottarelli, who was the European Data Protection Supervisor in the EU. Ethics comes before, during, and after the law. So the law is about compliance. There are certain things you have to conform to because otherwise you might legally get into trouble. Ethics should really go beyond that. As public sector organizations in particular, we should be exemplifying best practice. We should be showing that we're being proactively transparent about where we're using AI and really pushing the best ways to use AI. We're not trying to just get away with the bare minimum of legal compliance in this area. And the kind of way of approaching this, there isn't actually a specific set of rules at the moment that goes across the public sector about using AI tools. But there are certainly already legal controls in place. We don't have a specific we don't have a specific AI law in the UK. There is one in the EU, but there are some principles we can apply. So in terms of the law that still applies, even without us having a brand new artificial intelligence law, we're talking primarily about the Data Protection Act and GDPR, both of which you'll probably be familiar with. So the kind of principles embedded in these laws are data needs to be used for a specific purpose. Now, where this often trips people up with AI projects is if you captured a load of data for one purpose, for a mailing list, let's say, and now you want to put it into an AI model, you may well have to go back and ask for consent at that point. Now, there are different types of consent. There can be implied consent. You can get people to tick, a box on a website, but always check if you are reusing data for a different purpose, are you confident that you have the consent of the people who gave you that data to do that? So this is cropping up a lot in the NHS, where there are tools being used for things like automating or speeding up the production of discharge letters for patients leaving hospital. It's a very onerous, admin-heavy part of what doctors need to do. So a patient's ready to go home, we have their notes, but we need to produce this specific letter in this particular format. they're trying to use AI tools to produce a draft of that can then be checked by the doctor. But that does require the AI tool to have access to medical records and things like that. So there is a process of consent that needs to be added into that. Data protection impact assessments, DPIAs, are the other thing that will crop up here, as well as capturing consent. So that is essentially a risk assessment on if you are using data for a new purpose. You should do one of those if you are working with anything that might be contentious or private around people's data using AI tools. Individuals should know where their data is being used and how. So why is that data being captured and what is it being used for? The more proactive we can be on this, the better. There's a great initiative in the city of Amsterdam in the Netherlands where they have what they call an algorithm registry, which is if the city of Amsterdam deploys any AI tools, or if you're a third party and you work with the local authority in Amsterdam, they have a publicly accessible register that shows you all of the algorithms that are being used. It tells you what data they capture, why they're being used, what the benefits are, and also what risk assessment has been carried out. They have not just parked that away in the FAQs on their website. It's very publicly visible. They worked with journalists and like citizen activists to make sure it was publicized. So that's an example of very good practice of being very transparent and forward. We should be telling people what the benefits of using these tools are, but we also need to be honest about what risks we've assessed and also what data is involved in the process, because individuals need to know that. Any data we store has to be accurate and secure. So security of data is very important. It shouldn't be leaking out to, ChatGPT or anyone else. It needs to be kept within our organization. And we need to keep that data up to date and accurate. So if you have very old data on people and you start using it for AI tools, well, then the inaccuracy of that data might create skewed results. And the general principle under the law is we keep the minimum amount of data for the most limited time possible. So there is it's not acceptable to hoard data, to just say, okay, we're going to keep all that stuff and see if we need it later on. And particularly when that data relates to individuals, we need to be very careful about that. Then going beyond that and thinking about ethics, the principle that's currently in place is that we should apply the Nolan principles to usage of AI in the public sector. And as a reminder, the Nolan principles are honesty, integrity, objectivity, openness, leadership, selflessness, and accountability. And these are all supposed to direct the behavior of public officials in the work that they do. So you can think about how some of these would apply to how we think about using AI tools. We need to be honest, as in clear, transparent. We are using AI in this situation for this purpose. Objectivity would cover things like bias in data sets. Now, it's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but if you have historical data that is very skewed in one direction, maybe it doesn't represent the ethnic diversity of the population you're working with, then that might create skewed outcomes at the other end. So that's where objectivity might come in. Openness, we need to be transparent. Leadership, we need to be pushing best practice, not just trying to do the bare minimum in terms of compliance. We obviously don't want to be doing anything selfish in this. We should be focused on what good does this produce for the members of the public that we serve. And all of this we need to be accountable for. There is going to be no situation in which we can get around a decision that's been made by saying, well, the AI did it. It wasn't us. Human beings are going to be the people who are responsible. So you need to know what could go wrong. You need to educate yourself. And the more contentious the use case gets, or the more sensitive the data you're working with, the more important those things become, which is why the data protection impact assessments can be a very useful tool. By the way, you can Google data protection impact assessment if you want to see a breakdown of what that looks like and get kind of templates for what should go into those, or just put the name into the chat. Even if you're not from the UK, that's useful because the principles in it are applicable to lots of different territories as well. And finally, in order to oversee all this stuff, it probably feeds into some kind of process of AI governance, which really should sit underneath your existing data governance systems. So you should have data governance documents for what you do within your organization. You should have various levels of people who are responsible for adhering to that kind of policy. But if you are thinking about deploying something that's quite ambitious in terms of AI or uses very potentially sensitive data, then these are the stages that often go into that process. So initially, you do some kind of assessment. So that would include the data protection assessment, but also include an assessment of the potential benefits for deploying AI in a given area. Now, if you're talking about AI to sift your emails, that's a very, very low risk situation. But if you were talking about AI to be involved in the decision making process around who gets benefits, you've just entered a way more contentious area where a lot more could go wrong. So this kind of process becomes stricter the more potential risk there is involved in a use case. So the assessment stage, what are the proposed benefits and what are the potential harms? We need to do that before we do anything, before we plug real data into anything. Then you've got to design the system, which hopefully is going to be building on some existing technology. We're not talking about coding something up from scratch. So we're picking up an existing tool. But here we need to look at things like how can we ensure that the data we're feeding into it is of a high quality, because otherwise, garbage in, garbage out. We need to be giving it stuff that we trust. Is our internal documentation up to date? Think questions like that. And if we think there are potential risks, how will we mitigate those as part of the process? How do we make sure there are stop points? There are bits when somebody checks something. Then you can do a bit of building something and testing it. And that's where you probably need to assess, okay, how will we measure the benefits? So how do we know this is going to be something that's going to benefit the organization and the recipients of our service? And can we explain the output? So if somebody questions this, if somebody questions a decision that comes out of this AI tool, how are we going to explain how that decision was arrived at? Then deploying it, you need to train staff to know that it's being deployed and how they can interact with it. And you also need to inform members of the public or the ultimate users of your service. So this is partly the transparency thing, but it's also telling people things like, if you see something that's going wrong here, this is how you tell us, so that we can catch those things as early as possible and we can make sure that they don't roll on and on. And then finally, a process of ongoing monitoring. So we want to be checking what's coming out of these AI tools. Is it consistently staying at a good level of quality in terms of the outcomes? And also, how will we update it if we need to? How can we change it? Does it need to be fed more data on a regular basis to make sure it's kept up to date? If it was trained on our documents from 5 years ago, then we probably want to give it newer stuff so that it can be basing its decisions off the best available documentation. Okay, so just a few points of summary, and then I'm going to dive into the chat now. So experiment with AI tools, do so carefully. So I'm certainly a big fan of experimentation. And as I say, the most likely things you're going to get hold of at the moment will be things like Microsoft Copilot, but you may get access to other tools or things that are more custom for your particular sector or your particular organization. Don't be afraid to play around with them, ask questions about them, see what they're actually useful for. Have an objective in mind though. So think about, once you've got your kind of oriented around what the tools can do, start to think about, okay, where could this actually provide benefits? And that's probably predominantly going to be in saving you time initially. Although I'd be amazed if there aren't people in the public sector who are asking about, can AI tools help us decide who gets benefits or process asylum seekers? Those are very, very contentious use cases. And I don't think at this stage that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how to get you spending less time sifting through your email inbox, producing PowerPoint presentations, reading through massive long policy documents to find a single fact. Those things take up inordinate amounts of people's time, and they're also not a great use of your expertise and your experience. So try and point the tools at those things initially, because those are all efficiency gains, productivity gains, but have an idea of, okay, is this going to save me time? It's only ever going to be as good as the data you put into it, whatever tool you're working with. So if I've said, it can read through documents on your intranet, well, that only really works well if you keep the documents on your intranet up to date. If it's reading out of date HR policies, then it will give you out of date advice. So we only want to be really putting stuff into it if we're confident that it's correct. So that will be things like our internal spreadsheets, documentation, policy documents, things that have already been signed off and so on. And just be transparent and honest about the risks and the opportunities. Do think about, particularly if you're deploying anything public facing, what might be the potential risk here? We know what the benefits might be, what might be the downside, and how do we mitigate that if we need to? Okay, So I'm going to rattle through the chat now if anyone does have any questions. Just a reminder that there is a longer version of this training and there's variations on this training. I'm getting much more hands-on with some of these tools. So if you want information on that, then you can go to Modern Gov and find that out. But let me just check back through the chat and see what questions we had. Feel free to add any more questions in as they occur to you. So the AI tool that could check everyone's calendars and set up meetings, I was predominantly thinking about Microsoft Copilot there because that functionality is in there. There should be a summarized tool for Teams chat if you have the Copilot license. Can Copilot read PDF diagrams? That's a very good question. So I would give it a go. It can certainly interpret images when I've used it. It might be able to give you and it should be able to generate an image using the create part of Copilot. But I would just give that a go to see if it can read diagrams. Is it better to use agents? Yeah, agents were on the edge of what I could talk about today. So if you're talking about Microsoft Copilot agents, they're slightly misnamed because they're not really using agentic AI, which is the latest kind of frontier bit of AI. They're actually really assistants. So the way that agents work in Copilot is if you have something you regularly want to carry out, rather than typing the prompt in every time or copy and pasting it every time, you can essentially put a wrapper around it and create like a mini app. So if you wanted to consistently say, turn these meeting notes into this specific format of documents, you could wrap those instructions together, and then you've just got something where you can just give it the meeting notes, and it will automatically spit out the formatted document. So they are a good shortcut, but they're essentially assistants. If you're talking about agentic AI, that is kind of beyond the scope of what I can cover today. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. Yes, so the AI tool should be able to both record and create minutes of a meeting, and you could specify the format you want the minutes to be in as well by giving it like last week's or giving it a structure to actually follow. One thing to be careful of here, I have heard of some recording tools. I mean, they give you a noise and it tells all the attendees that they are being recorded, but you don't really want those recordings going on without telling the attendees. If you think about some of the more sensitive meetings you might be in, there was a tool that was being experimented with in central government, and they weren't aware that it had this recording functionality in it for video meetings. And if you think about some of the meetings at that level might involve literally top secret material, that's not even, a small error. That's essentially espionage. But there will be other areas of sensitivity. You wouldn't want, a team of social workers doing casework without knowing that the recording was on, because there may be things discussed there that you want to be careful around. But for your routine team meetings, yeah, absolutely, it can record and create the minutes. And actually, Lucy has confirmed that that happens. Can I show a quick demo of it being used in 7 minutes? I will. I'll see how far I can get. I can orient you to it. I'm just checking the rest to see what other questions. So very good question from Murad, which was how do we balance AI efficiency with maintaining human judgment? So I think that you need to make sure that there's that human in the loop principle, that we are the people who are checking the final thing. Now, it's safer to do stuff internally where a small mistake made by AI might not offend anyone or create some kind of incident. But if you were doing anything that's going to be public facing, then that principle becomes even more important. So this is, I'm within, just in terms of a demo cap, I'm within Microsoft Copilot now. I can type instructions into this chat, like give me a summary of this document. I can then add documents to it by uploading a file. And I need to not use anything contentious, but I'm fairly sure I will have some kind of public sector document in my Modern Gov folder. Too many windows open. What would be a good one to do? So this is a DWP report. It's about a 50-page PDF. I'm going to open that up and just get it to give me a summary. While that's running, I will answer additional questions because it's no fun just watching a progress bar on someone's screen. But this is the kind of thing you can do quite easily. When I mentioned agents before, those are down the left-hand side. That's where the agents will appear. So you can see that Copilot has already gone through, as I say, it's a 50-page document. It's already gone through and it's given me a bullet pointed list of everything that is in that document. I could then quite easily specifically pull out bits of this and then ask further questions about it at all. So one way to think about these tools is they make everything conversational. So you can chat with a document, you can chat with a set of meeting notes, you can chat with your email inbox. That's one good way to think about them. There are much more advanced things that Copilot can do. It also exists within your apps as well. So you can actually ask it to create from a set of notes a PowerPoint slide deck and so on. I don't think I've missed any questions, but I'm just looking through. That's a good question, Chandni. So will it consider accessibility? Microsoft's fairly hot on accessibility. So I would say at a minimum, you could get it to check a document for accessibility and it should give you a decent set of notes. PDF documents are notoriously not great from an accessibility standpoint, but you could ask it to turn it into a more accessible Word document or something like that. But certainly, given the accessibility tools that are built into other Microsoft software, I would be amazed if Copilot doesn't know quite a lot about how to make things accessible and meeting standards and so on. Any resources that might help manage expectations on AI? I don't have anything that comes to mind off the top of my head. I do recognize the problem you've raised, though, Robin. And it tends to veer between two different use cases. Either people are scared of AI and they don't want to use it at all, or they think that they can put everything through AI, which is equally not a good way to approach these tools. I think highlighting places where things have gone wrong. You will occasionally see news stories that come out where AI has been used in a fairly unethical or inelegant way and has had some kind of downside. I would certainly say the human in the loop principle of we need humans to check all of this stuff and be responsible for this stuff. Because ultimately, if something goes wrong, it's the humans that are going to get blamed. Nobody is going to sue Microsoft Copilot. And so because you're ultimately going to be responsible, you should be checking everything. There is also, if you don't get used to putting decent prompts into these tools, then you will get very samey content. So I've heard lots of complaints from people who work in communications teams of people overusing AI, and there is a very familiar tone to it, which is slightly over enthusiastic, which is not a very British thing, I have to say. And it can introduce errors because you haven't pointed at a particular source of information. So those are the kind of things that can go wrong. So I don't have a direct resource for you, but those are the things I would consider. Okay, scan the chat. It can do stuff within PowerPoint if you have the full license for Copilot. So it can generate slide decks automatically. It can match them to existing slide templates, and it does a fairly good job from what I can see so far. So Murad, that's an interesting question. ChatGPT quite limited on religious topics. There are subjects which these tools will naturally veer away from or get very nervous about asking about. One of the big areas that's been of concern recently is anything that looks like you're asking it a kind of therapy question. That's a very contentious area. So it's starting to not be willing to give you therapist type advice. But sometimes it's a single keyword that it will pick up on. So if you do say, please design this PowerPoint slide deck for me, I really want it to be dynamite, then bear in mind it may pick up on the word dynamite, think you're trying to build a bomb and not give you a response. So sometimes you just have to check the keywords. It may be avoiding religious topics because it doesn't want to offend anyone on a simple level, which may not be useful, but that might be what it's doing. I think I've covered off all the questions now, unless anyone wants to flag another one.
Yeah, I think thanks, Anne. I think yeah, that's all that we've got time for, I'm afraid, everybody. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and thank you, Alan. Really grateful. As we said, you'll receive a copy of the slides and recording afterwards. And thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.